Alrighty then. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Matthew Baker of Beautiful New York Tours. A very dear old friend of mine recently asked me about rooftop gardens in New York City. And it was a great question because it is something that maybe half the time, maybe three-quarters, people notice. If you are walking around the streets of New York, or if you're riding in an open-top bus or anything like that, and you look up, often you will see topiary spilling out over the edges of buildings, not in a dangerous manner, but simply branches with leaves and pretty flowers that can be peeked at from the street level. And you realize that there are gardens on the roofs of buildings. And it's important, especially on the island of Manhattan, which is 13 miles by 2.5 miles, and there are between 3 and 4 million people there at any given time. There's no room for private gardens the way people who live elsewhere might think of them. So where do you put your gardens? You put them on the roof where there's space and where there's sunlight. And some of them are really, really stunning. Now, of course, the overwhelming majority of these rooftop gardens are private. So if you don't know someone who lives in one of those buildings, you don't get to see those gardens up close. But there are the occasional exceptions, and one of my favorite exceptions is the elevated acre, which is on the roof of the Emblem Health building at number 55 Water Street. And it is a wonderful place where people work in the building often take their lunch breaks out there and get some good fresh air. You have incredibly beautiful views of the East River and of the Brooklyn Bridge, and of course the garden that is right there at your feet. I'm also a big fan because my mother built the building in the late 1960s when women did not have professions like construction engineer. She was one of the few and served as the blueprint analyst for the construction of 55 Water Street. So, as I often like to say, yay mom. But there are other great gardens in the city that are not on the rooftops, but just really worth seeing that are public. There are two incredible gardens in Central Park. One is up at the north end of the park, the Conservatory Garden, which is actually 3 gardens in one. But there's also the Shakespeare Garden, and the drama lover in me loves the Shakespeare Garden because a Shakespeare garden is a very specific thing. It is a garden in which every plant, tree, flower, and shrub, etc. shows up somewhere in Shakespeare's works, whether in his sonnets or his plays. And there are a few major cities in the world that have Shakespeare gardens. New York is the only city that has 2. There is the one in Central Park, and there is another one in the Brooklyn Botanical Garden, which is most famous for its annual Cherry Blossom Festival. Now, the Brooklyn Botanical Garden is not the only major botanic garden of its kind in New York. There's actually one in each borough, except for Manhattan. But the New York Botanical Garden up in the Bronx is definitely a stunner and is a mecca for the study as well as the enjoyment of plant life for gardeners and gardening experts from all over the world. I remember in particular a wonderful exhibition they did a few years back where they did their emulation of Monet's garden at Giverny, and in the greenhouse they actually built their copy of the bridge that you see in a lot of Monet's paintings, that little footbridge that is so charming. Now, the other major garden in the Bronx is way up north at Wave Hill. That takes a while to get to, but it's really worth it. Again, the views this time across the Hudson River are quite stunning, and the nature walks are really lovely. You would never know that you were within the limits of New York City. Now, the Botanical Garden can easily be paired with a visit to the Bronx Zoo within the same day. They are very close to each other. Now, for all of these lovely public gardens, there are also great community gardens. This is very much a city of apartment living, where there's a huge amount of shared space in a very densely populated city. So unless you have a huge amount of money and can afford a townhouse with a backyard, you don't have your own back garden the way people who live in more rural areas would be accustomed. But community gardens are where you have shared gardening space where everybody gets their own little plot and they're gardening together, and that makes gardening a communal experience, which can be wonderful. And there are various rules to the communal gardens, including when they might be open to others to come and explore. Some of them are really wonderful, especially down in the East Village. There was a time when you had very little greenery and very little great communal activity. During the bad old days of the late 70s and 80s in New York, when crime was high and safety was low, you didn't have these things. And there were big community efforts to improve things like community gardens as a way of bringing the neighborhood back to what those who had settled here had dreamed. One of the community leaders who established a lot of these East Village community gardens was the popular actress and singer Bette Midler. So there's definitely a lot of wonderful greenery to be seen in this concrete jungle, and I would love to show it to you. When it is safe to do so, please check me out at Beautiful New York Tours. You can search Beautiful New York Tours on Facebook or email me at baker.tours@yahoo.com. Again, that is baker.tours@yahoo. Thank you very much.